Okay. Yes. So, if you're catching this in the restream after the fact, then I can tell you, once I know my stream is coming through, yeah, it should be live. So, if you're catching this in the restream, then look below and there'll be a comment that has a bunch of timestamps of all the questions that I'll be covering today. And I'm going to try and get through as many as I can in the order as they come in. I just want to answer anything on your mind that might be holding you back from learning your language, getting into your New Year's resolution, all that fun stuff. And I'll be available for about an hour. So let's see what we can do as people are asking their questions today. And so I see a few people on YouTube are saying, we got Elizabeth from California, we got Rami in Cyprus coming at you, very good, and we got people all over Facebook, all over everything. So I'm going to start with Sarah Holhouse's question on Facebook, and that is, when I pronounce the Spanish R, sometimes it sounds like an English D sound. Is that normal? Is that normal sometimes? I would say that is a very good idea if you're kind of getting into it, because what the mistake a lot of people make is they try to use the English R. They start from that point. So they might say, el carro, and they might work from there. But the Spanish R is actually, I always tell people, it's like halfway between an L and a D in English. So if you want to get it, then you're going to try and maybe say la, da, and then somewhere in between. That's more or less the Spanish R, like oversimplified, obviously. But I would say if you're kind of pronouncing it like a D, you aren't too far off. So still can like really get that tapping sound is different. Your tongue is positioned a different way. But I would say you're better doing that than you are doing the English R for sure. So I hope that answers that question. And if I'm coming through clear to everybody, then let me know. I want to make sure I'm not neglecting any questions from anyone. Here we go. I wanted to make sure your questions were popping up on my screen there. And yeah, so you can see your YouTube questions rolling in. All right, let's see what else we've got here. We got EB saying, thanks to Fluent in 3 months, I've reached intermediate level in French after 8 failed attempts during my life. Wow, that is impressive. Very happy to hear that, EB. I can point you in the right direction, but you're the one ultimately doing all the work, so it's fair play, as we say in Ireland. Good job with that. I can understand 70% of TV shows. That's amazing. You're already doing better than where I was for the majority of my Spanish learning. It took me a very long time to get to, I would say, 70% comprehension. So, great job. I congratulate you, EB. Okay, and let's see, we've got a question from Kat, who says, have you noticed some changes within the languages you've learned? I know sometimes language adapts to new modern ways. Yeah, absolutely. So I would say in terms of what's different to what my books would tell me and what's on paper, I have a unique fascination with the text language, as it were. So, as you text someone, like if you're texting in English, it would be BRB for be right back, and L number 8 R for later, that kind of stuff. I would look for that in the languages that I'm learning. So, for instance, you don't really see them in books, but you're learning French, you have to know that the equivalent of LOL, laugh out loud, is MDR, or mot de rire, and then the equivalent in Spanish is just, you would sound it out, you would say ha 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 ha, except they would say it with a European Spanish twang, ha 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 ha, something like that. So it's J-A-J-A-J-A, and then Brazilian Portuguese, it's RS, which is kind of like the word laugh kind of written quickly like that. So that is the interesting, unique thing that I like to find in languages that have changed over time. And as this applies even to more useful situations beyond just kind of quick texts. Like when I learned the beginner Egyptian Arabic, I actually used Romanized version of learning a lot of the words, because I was learning that dialect, which when people texted each other, they sometimes actually do text using the Romanized version. So that's that kind of like equivalency. For me, it was kind of like learning some computer code or something, and that is a newly like something new that's come up in all of these languages because of the emergence of text language over the last decade or two. So that's an interesting little sidebar, I'd say. Okay, so on Periscope we have Matt Kelly 20, who has a quick question for me. Tips for learning Korean. Okay, I haven't learned Korean myself, but what I can tell you is, firstly, the writing system is phonetic. It's one of the most logical writing systems in the world, and there's a really cute comic that I've seen floating around the internets that kind of show you how to get used to the writing system quickly. So maybe search for comic Korean writing system, something along those lines. And other than that, I'm not sure about Korean, because I've learned other Asian languages, but I've never learned Korean. So I wouldn't give you any tips beyond what I would say for every language. To try to speak as soon as possible, to find native speakers or find a teacher that you can talk to via Skype. And if that's your focus, if you happen to be more passionate about speaking with people. But then if you want to learn to read the language, your approach changes that way. It's very hard to give tips that cover an entire language when each person has unique goals and priorities. But definitely when it comes to phonetic languages that that use any kind of script that you can learn relatively quickly, I would try to do that as soon as you can. Even Thai looks very strange, but it has I think 76 letters, and I got the gist of them in just a day because I was coming up with interesting mnemonics. Maybe go to Memrise. I'm sure they would have mnemonics for helping you with Korean. That's memorise.com. And I'm sure there's other people in the chat who could give way better advice for Korean specifically than I can. I can only say what I would do if I was learning Korean myself. Okay. Next we have Sarah Holehouse again on Facebook, who's asking, I'm conversationally fluent in Spanish, and I'm now trying to learn French. My native tongue is English. What are your tips overall for learning French, especially along the lines of speaking and pronunciation? Thanks. Okay, so going from Spanish to French, that's similar to where I was coming from. So learning French, well, one huge advantage that you're going to have starting from Spanish that a lot of people would feel held back by is they don't tend to it's not very easy if you're just starting French to remember the gender of words, whether it's masculine or feminine. There are patterns. You can absolutely learn those patterns, and I recommend you look up what they are. But the great thing is that coming from Spanish, you can think for a second what the Spanish word is, and Spanish tends to be way more consistent in making it easy to guess whether something's masculine or feminine for the most part. So I kind of cheated a lot. Like for instance, when you see the French word for beach, which is plage, P-L-A-G-E, it's kind of hard to know is that masculine or feminine, because there are other A-G-E words that would be one or the other. Then I would just think, oh, in Spanish it's la playa, and the word is very similar looking, so it turns out it is la plage. And that's kind of a little trick that I would give you to really think about if you're coming from Spanish to French, that you have that advantage, and you can really kind of, if you could think, like, if it is close enough and you know the meaning is the same, it's very likely going to have exactly the same gender. There are exceptions, obviously. There are a couple of exceptions, but for the most part, that's a tip I would give you. And then otherwise, just learn French like as its own thing. I would kind of take maybe a break from Spanish so that you could really intensely push your French up, and then you might reach a stage where you are then ready to mix and match between them, because it's going to be a challenge to separate them in your head. And for me, I was able to do that best when I was really intensely learning one language and kind of pushing the other one to the side and coming back to it when my new language was at a higher level. Okay, so checking up on some of the comments, we have Lydia, who organizes the Polyglot events that you guys are going to see in Slovakia, is popping in both Facebook and YouTube. And she says, are you coming to Bratislava for this year's Polyglot Gathering? Very appropriate question. We hope to have you with us. I am going to decide that soon. I'm trying to come up with my travel plans for the year, and I already know the next talk that I want to give. I got a burst of inspiration the other day. Just have to make sure the logistics of traveling to Slovakia in terms of my timing works out, and I will let you know very soon about that. And I'll of course tweet it so everybody can know to pop over to Bratislava and find me there. Whether I'm there or not, any of you guys watching this, if you can make it to Slovakia easily, I would highly recommend that you check out the Polyglot Gathering. It is not a place where you see people showing off and where if you're not a polyglot you're not allowed there. It's nothing like that. It's a very warm and welcoming environment. A lot of people who attend are just getting into learning languages, and they are kind of finding a lot of inspiration, and you might recognize a couple of people from YouTube, from blogs, and you'll find they're very approachable, and everyone just wants to help. There is no kind of show-offness at this event. It's a really warm community, so I'd highly recommend that, and hopefully I'll know soon enough. Hopefully I will be there myself at the Polyglot Gathering. Okay, so let's see. Next question. I see a bunch of questions popping up here for me on YouTube that I want to cover. Let's see. We got Diana, who says, sometimes I know what I want to say in Spanish, and I can come up within my head during a group conversation, but not fast enough to say it out loud. Is that still making progress? Yeah, it's tricky. So when it comes to group conversations, like talking a language and even talking out loud with a native speaker is something that I feel I'm up for doing at level B1, at the lower intermediate level, because I find a single person, they're very likely going to adjust for my benefit very, very easily. So they might notice that I'm a learner still, and I'm not necessarily able to understand people speaking at full speed. So what they'll do is they'll slow down. And oh, look at this! I just saw a super chat come in there. Thank you for that, Andy Roberts. I'll be getting to your question shortly. If you find that you're sorry, lost track of what I was saying there. This was Diana's question. Yes, so if you find that you're in a group of people, you lose that ability that you had when you were with one individual, and what happens is they tend to kind of balance out and talk at normal speed. And that's harder because you have to keep up, and that's essentially almost the same thing as watching TV, because you watch TV, they're not slowing down for learners' benefits, they're just presuming everyone watching is a native speaker, so they'll speak quickly. And that's why what I would do is I would try to have as many one-on-one conversations as you possibly can, because that's going to really kind of prepare you for the scope of vocabulary, the kind of speeds people might talk at. You might kind of switch between teachers, and they may start to get faster, start to use more complicated vocabulary. But I personally don't tend to join a lot of group conversations where the majority of people are native speakers until I'm at that solid B2, the upper intermediate. That's kind of where I feel I can start to say I'm fluent. I still have a lot of things to learn, but I can not slow down the conversation. I can participate and talk to people about a large number of subjects. So that's kind of what I would say in terms of the like whether it's too soon or if it's too hard. You can test the waters, but try to have more one-on-one conversations. You can do that for free if you get an exchange, of course. You can do that with a teacher relatively cheap depending on where you go. So that is what I would recommend for just working on that. Okay, so now I saw this super chat, and I do, as you can see in the bottom right corner, I do like to prioritize the super chats here. So Andy says, Benny, do you still plan to make more language hacking books in other languages? People keep telling me I wish it was available in blank language. Yes, Andy. So you may have seen on my emails and in the last couple of live videos that I've been doing that I have a personal project right now to get on top of my workflow, because writing the 4 books, the language hacking books on Spanish, Italian, French and German, writing those the year before last, kind of it was an interesting experience, but it was a lot of work and it threw me out of whack, and I kind of lost my momentum in getting things done efficiently. So I'm trying to get that efficiency back, and as I get it back and as I know I can handle my workflow, that's when I'm going to start like skyrocketing all the other languages. And we've done a lot of the groundwork for the kinds of methods that we used while we teach, so that I can collaborate with native speakers and with people who can help me develop these courses in languages that I don't speak very well, but still having the same philosophy. So we will definitely be making a lot more of those courses, and I'm hoping if I can get like really dived into it in the next few months, that maybe about this time next year or early next year, you might start seeing the next ones popping on the shelf. And if I can get that happening, then I'm going to start getting as many languages as I can, both the big and the small. I want to kind of make sure that the course doesn't just go from the most learned languages down, that we really kind of balance it out. And working with Teach Yourself for that is great, because they are not afraid of making courses for smaller languages. And this is why I started with the bigger one, the FIGS as they call it, FIGS, French, Italian, German, Spanish. Those are the more profitable languages, and that would get the books out to more people. It would get it like more impressive sales numbers, so the bookstores would start thinking, this is nice, I think I will stock this book for all of its future editions, and then we can give more prominent placement to maybe language hacking Irish or other languages like that. So I can't right now definitively tell you when the next books are coming out, which languages are coming out, but I can tell you that it is a very big priority, and it's one of the reasons why at the root of it, my routine is it's what's holding me back, and I'm fixing that as soon as I can, and then everything can change in terms of my personal language learning projects and my language hacking book writing projects. So thank you very much for that super chat question, much appreciated. All right, so let's see what else have we got on the list of questions here. So Holly's passing me on the questions. I'm going to kind of leave it up to her. If you can, Holly, make sure you scroll up. I want to make sure we didn't miss any of the earlier YouTube questions, and otherwise I'm going to go through in the order that she's passing them on to me, and hopefully I'll get to as many of your questions as possible. So Paul Howlett says, hi, how much practice do you put into maintaining your languages? Very good question. So when you see my brand name, Fluent in 3 months, a lot of people imagine that might be 3 months learning one language, 2 months learning another, and so on. But in my best stride of learning languages, what I might do is learn one new language for 3 months, but then spend the other 9 months doing nothing but maintaining languages, both trying to give the language I've just learned some solid ground, but also going back to the other languages that I've learned, making sure I'm giving them a boost, I'm practicing them, I'm using them, and I'm maintaining them. So during an intensive project where I'm learning a new language, I will give 0 practice to maintaining the other ones, because for me, focus is so important. And if I'm trying to learn a brand new language, but I'm also allotting time for making sure I'm practicing my French, maybe reading a little German, then that's just not going to work for me. What I find is just it's asking too much. I'm not skilled at doing that. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to focus only on the new language intensively, But once that's done, the majority of the time I am trying to maintain all of my languages. So in terms of practice, I would say it's most of my time is practicing the new languages. And that's actually once I've got on top of my routine and my time management, as I'll be updating you guys on that project. The first thing I'm going to do before I learn a new language is make sure I do a period of maintenance of the languages I've already learned. So that's maintenance is very important. It's going to be a big priority for me. I recommend it's a priority for you too. All right. So Random Rami Emperor on YouTube. Kunis Olam Gaelga Alev. How do I learn how to read Irish? That's a good question, and I can help you in terms of the phonetics. If you look at, oddly enough, what is my most thumbed up video on YouTube, and this is like a new milestone for me. I got a video that reached 10,000 thumbs up, which is not something that happens when you get like a viral video. It's like a video that really gets the most views for the entire video, that people share a lot. And that's my video on how to pronounce Irish words. So if you check that video out, it'll give you a rule of thumb. But because you're writing the question to me, Oscailga, as they say, so how would you learn how to read Irish? There's some good sites. One of my, probably the one I'd recommend most is beo.ie, so that's beo.ie, and they have articles, like it's kind of like a newspaper style, and you have various articles that come out, and what they do is they have a kind of a mouse over option that you can see interesting new words that you might learn. And then otherwise there are tools like you could potentially just kind of find a book in Irish. The Harry Potter series is in Irish, for instance, and you can use a tool like Anki to import the words as they come up. And kind of there's a lot of there's different ways that you would improve your reading skills in a language. That's a whole thing in itself, and you would apply those to Irish, but ultimately there's still lots of stuff that you can find to read in Irish, and you would just find that and maybe copy and paste it into another system, and you read that on the go. You could convert it into Amazon Kindle format if you want to read it on your Kindle. You can read it on a tablet on your smartphone, whatever it might be, and then just note the new words as they come up, and that's essential. This is kind of something they do over at Link, like LINGQ. I don't think they have Irish available there. Someone correct me if I'm wrong on that, but like what they do in general is they give you text to read, and then you get the words that you don't know yet highlighted separately. So that's kind of a particular thing you might be able to do. Of course, it depends on your reading level and all that. Okay? So, next question. We have Alan Watts on YouTube. I've plateaued in my Mandarin learning. No, not plateauing. No. Okay. Back to your question. My busy schedule is limiting me to lots of passive input, mostly listening, reading, and basic speaking. Okay, so the question probably, how do I get out of this plateau? So, your busy schedule is limiting you. That's tricky because that question is mostly like the very thing I'm trying to solve myself now, the time management issue. Because you're getting a lot of passive input, but if you've got a busy schedule, then is that really a good use of your time? Like if I'm working on whatever, like I'm writing a thing in English, and I have the radio on in Mandarin in the background, that's not gonna help me a whole lot. I might kind of make me feel like I'm doing something, but my brain is actively working on the thing that I'm looking at. So maybe you have like a super brain to multitask. I personally can't do that myself. So if you're too busy to do more than just having those, because you say you're doing reading and basic speaking, so that is time invested that you do have to kind of focus 100%. So what I would say is try to see, why is that not working for you? How can you look at your schedule and rearrange it? Like, are there things that you may just have to accept for the next while that you have to give up? Maybe you can't do that with work, but you can do that on the personal side. Like, do you watch a couple of hours of Netflix each week? Maybe that's time that you would decide, okay, no Netflix for the next few months because I really want that extra time for my Mandarin. And when we think of our busy schedules, we don't really we don't realize that there are a lot of moments that we can, if we were willing to make the sacrifice, we can find this extra time, you know. So that's what I would say for your Mandarin. And in terms of plateauing, I always say to people, you're plateauing because you're doing the same thing over. You need to change it up. You need to try a different strategy. So clearly passive learning, I mean, it's not a huge eureka moment to realize passive learning is not going to skyrocket you to the next level. So I would just recommend that you try to change it, make it more active, make a sacrifice so that you have the time to not have basic speaking, but have true one-on-one dedicated Mandarin time, or whatever the language anyone else might be learning. That's what I would recommend. Okay, and next we have EB again on YouTube. What are some examples of intermediate goals? I speak 4 times a week. Speaking easily is my top priority, but I don't know what I should focus on. Any ideas? Okay, so intermediate goals. Yeah, so if you're speaking a lot, I would say speaking can kind of start to get downgraded in your list of priorities. For me, as a beginner, speaking has to be priority number 1. But as an intermediate learner, I will speak, but I'll make sure that my speaking is very specific in like what I'm trying to achieve. So I might have a Skype lesson with a teacher, but instead of saying the Skype lesson is going to be about just how was your week, you know, because you've had those conversations over and over again. That's kind of going to maybe mean you're going to end up plateauing because you're not really doing anything to push yourself to the next level. I would make sure my teacher and I have agreed on some kind of a strategy. So maybe they're going to have a debate with me. Maybe they're going to make me watch a 1-minute YouTube video and we're going to discuss what happened in the video and we're going to disagree on things. You know, that kind of harder level of conversation. They might ask me what I believe about like something philosophical, you know. You could start to have these harder conversations, and that's something that can be an intermediate goal and something you can implement. In terms of like a goal and where you want to aim towards, I would generally use the CEFLR, the European Common Framework CEFLR like levels, and I would see B2, how it explains what a B2 is, or B1 if you feel like you're at lower intermediate and really want to make that solidified. Then I would see what is the definition, and that's your goal. Being at that level is the goal, and then you might have milestones along the way to get you there, and you have to come up with a plan and see how are you missing this part of reading, this part of writing. But speaking for intermediates tends to not be as important, and this is where I tend to do the normal stuff for language learning, the stuff that people tend to do at the beginning that they shouldn't really do at the beginning, but is still useful in its own way. So I would pick up a grammar book and I would study grammar, and I'd do exercises in the book that tells me like to fill in the gaps or whatever it is. So this isn't like a genius idea that you never would have thought of, but it's for me, this is the time when I'm ready to do that. I'm not ready to do that at the beginning stages because I don't have enough of the language for the grammar to be useful for me, because I don't have anything to put structure into. But if you've got lots of speaking practice, then I would say maybe have a goal of like completely satisfyingly finishing the next 5 chapters of your grammar book, for instance, and going through those grammar points that you find trickiest with your teacher in your spoken session, or your friends if you're practicing with them. So that's what I would recommend when it comes to intermediate goals. Hopefully that helps. All right, let's see what we got next. Somali Polyglot on YouTube. Do you mix up your languages when you speak? If you do, what do you do to help separate them? Okay, excellent question. When it comes to speaking multiple languages, it's always on people's minds, like, do you mix them up? So, in my case, absolutely, I will mix them up if I'm at the beginning stages with them. So whenever I start to learn a new language, if it's remotely related to any other language that I've learned, that's kind of going to act as my crutch in a way. So when I started learning Dutch, I relied tons on my German, and there was like a weird mixture of Dutch and German that I'd be speaking for the majority of my time trying to speak any Dutch. And it helps. It gives you the shortcut. It means you can express something, but it's kind of, you're still in this weird no man's land of not really being in one language or another. And now the problem is mixing them up is when one of them starts interfering with another. So after I learned Spanish to a decent beginning, like lower intermediate stage, I then moved to Italy, and I started speaking a majority of Italian, I started speaking Italiano, something between Italian and Spanish. But then I started to replace my Spanish with my Italian, and I couldn't really speak Spanish. So the problem was I didn't have a very solid level in Spanish at that time, so it's a lot easier to mix them up. And what happens for me personally is I feel that once I'm at the upper intermediate level, the B2 level, which if you're not familiar with it, is essentially where in social situations I can do pretty much what I would do in my native language in English. So I can have conversations about all sorts of stuff. Maybe I can't defend a thesis. I can't do something that would be more mastery level, but I can talk about most things that people casually talk about. That's the B2 upper intermediate level. If I can reach that level in a language, then I feel like, in a polyglot brain, if you imagine a metaphor, I feel like that language now has a wall around it. A very solid wall that nothing kind of drips over into the other languages, or the other languages, more importantly, don't kind of seep into it. And that's where I want to be. If I can get to that level, and I can build a wall around each language, then I don't tend to mix them up. The problem is, it takes time to get to that level, so I will always mix my new languages up, and it's unfortunate, but you try to take the best out of it. Like I mentioned earlier, the Spanish and French things, that I try to take advantage of things that I might know thanks to them being similar, but even if they're not similar, I might still kind of accidentally mix things up or use a word that doesn't mean anything in the language. So yeah, this happens, but the trick is to get to the B2 level, and this is why my strategy is focus on one language until I can get it as high as I can, ideally B2, and then I'll start maintaining. And you could still go beyond that B2, of course, but that B2 for me is where the magic truly begins in terms of your long-term life with the language. Okay, so if you want to separate them, that's the only solution, is you have to get them to good levels. There's no trick of drink an espresso while hopping on one leg. I can't give you any kind of quirky workarounds. It's just a lot of practice, a lot of time and energy invested into it. Okay, next we have most of our questions coming over on YouTube. I'll do a few more and then we'll catch up on the Facebook questions. So Walter Kovac, if I said that right, on YouTube. ¿Cuántos idiomas? I always forget which accent I have to put on when I start reading the language. So, if I get this right. Quantos idiomas uma pessoa bem preparada consegue aprender por ano? Pode responder em inglês. Obrigado. So, the question was in Portuguese. How many languages can a well-prepared person learn in a year or per year? So how many languages would you learn in a year? Ooh, I mean, what do you mean by learn a language? Like I can learn, like I said earlier, I don't speak Korean. I could learn 5 phrases in Korean. Does that count as me learning Korean this year? And if so, I could learn 100 languages this year. But in a more realistic sense, you would say that you've learned it to a certain level. And as I've been like drilling into you guys at this stage, that level for me has to be upper intermediate. And in ideal circumstances where you can make it a full-time project and you have a good learning strategy that you might have picked up from a previous project, it's possible in 3 months. It's like the premise of my initial blog post, the title, but I always tell people that's not what I'm about. it's maybe possible, but for most people, if they have a job that they are working, because I always work the rest of the year, so I have the time in that 3 months, that's not as likely. So maybe they need 6 months to get to that B2 level. Maybe they need the whole year, especially if it's one of their first languages. They may not get to that level in the first year. Like, how many languages can someone learn in a year? How long is a piece of string? Is this glass half empty or half full? These are wonderful philosophical questions. But they're not questions that have a very simple answer. So I would say that it depends, and I don't know who would be asking the question, but for me personally, I would not learn more than one language in a year, because my brain would probably start oozing out my ears. I learn one language and get into maintaining the others. So I wouldn't recommend people chuck up on too many, like so intensively. If you want to become a polyglot, that's a great goal, but that's a very long-term goal. This is something like a 5-year plan minimum, So I would recommend that it be one language per year, but there are lots of exceptions. There's lots of people, I'm sure, who in the chats who have successfully done it with more than one language. And if you don't have a goal that's as high as B2, you can absolutely do more languages than that. If you want to get by as a tourist, which would be like A1 or A2, you could absolutely do a half a dozen languages in a year, depending on if they're all related or something. Okay, so let's see. We're still getting loads of interesting questions for people. Matthias on YouTube, any suggestions for learning ASL, American Sign Language? So sign language, I loved the project I had with sign language, and the thing I always say in languages is you got to speak from day one. This is my mantra. And interestingly enough, even though by definition you wouldn't speak it out loud, I still had that same basic philosophy of sign from day one, and I would try to sign actively as much as possible. I didn't make it a case of getting I got my bookshelf behind me back here. One of them would have a sign language dictionary. I wouldn't make the project about study that dictionary day in and day out. I had to, from day one, find a deaf person and try to communicate with them. I found a tutor who could help me, and I worked with them on learning sign language. So I would do that. I would try to actively use the language, and you can still practice it. You could still, have flashcards with Anki. There's a lot of things you can do with sign language that work with spoken languages and written languages. But if you want to get good at actually using it, you have to actively use it, and you can do that via Skype. So even if you don't live near hard of hearing deaf people or other people who can sign, you could still do that via the internet. So finding people might be tricky, but the way I would learn it is absolutely going to be the same. All right, so let's see. We have... I'm going to start going through the questions faster now because we're in the last 15 minutes. So sorry if I miss your question. Don't worry, I'll do another one of these general Q&As in maybe 2 weeks. Make sure you are subscribed, you're following me, you're liking the page, you're whatever other terminology for whatever platform, and you click the bell icon and you'll get a ping when I go live, because I do some impromptu live streams, of course. So just keep that in mind, and then you'll be able to catch me and not miss the questions, or not have me miss the questions, I should say. Okay, so Sarah Holhouse on Facebook. Do you have any tips for advancing my conversational level in Spanish to more and more fluent, or getting closer to mastery? Okay, so if you're at a conversational level and you want to get more fluent, I think I covered a few of the things today, like working on your grammar, doing particular exercises, having more complex conversations. In general though, if you're working up towards mastery level, I'm sure people can, and everyone, feel free to, if you see questions you know the answer to, feel free to respond and at that person, because we've got a lot of smart people. I recognize a lot of these names, and these people can help you. So everyone, share your knowledge. I'm going to try and help as much as I can, but everyone else, if you've seen a question you know the answer to, feel free to answer it. Okay, but for this one, I would recommend that you, if it's possible, try to use the European Common Framework. So in Spanish, that is the DELE, Diploma de Español como Lengua Extranjera, and that's the one I used to kind of put some framing on my Spanish progress. So I prepared to sit that exam. You don't need to be attending a university or any particular school. You don't even need to necessarily sit the exam. You can prepare for mock exams and have a teacher correct it for you. Although the real exam just kind of gives that extra pressure, and you have the professionally graded and all that, depending on your budget, timing and all that. But I would recommend using those as your milestones to aim towards and following the learning material for those, because I think coming up with methods myself to reach a level of C2 in a language, I'm not sure if I was just experimenting in different things, I'm not sure if I would have naturally made it in that direction. But by preparing for the C2 mastery level Spanish DELE diploma, I could see the things I needed to be able to learn, and things I needed to understand, things I needed to express, and that forced me to learn in that direction. And that helped me to have that level and reach that level and pass the exam, so that I would know that an independent group of people have told me that, rather than me saying, I feel pretty confident, I guess I'm a mastery level, because that's not quite the same thing. So I would recommend you use those European Common Framework exams to kind of set your sights on things, if that helps. Okay, so let's see a few questions that I'm going to flick through here. So SA on YouTube says, is it good to learn language first and then learn to read? This depends entirely on your goals. So I'm all about speaking, and I always tell people the method I would necessarily prescribe to people is not necessarily what everyone should do. I just happen to highly value speaking over other things. So for me, speaking is a priority. But there are lots of people, and you may be one of them, who feel like what creates a fiery passion in your heart for the language is reading, and that's what you want to do. You want to be able to absorb texts in their original language. That's great, and I would not say silly person wants to read. No, I'm not like that. I would totally respect that, and I would say in that case, don't do what I'm saying about speak from day one. I would say focus on reading, and that's what you want to do. That's what you want to do well. So make reading the central focus. I know that a lot of people who are following my channels would have more of a leaning towards speaking, and that's why I try to get them speaking first. Now in my case, when I want to really have that solid overall footing in the language, because to get that C2 diploma in Spanish, I had to have a very high reading level. So that's why I did start reading a ton, and I started really analysing, and not casually reading, but reading difficult texts, looking things up, and getting a teacher to ask me questions, so that it wasn't just a case of me remembering a fact, but I had to really think about it and read between the lines, as it were. So when I'm at the intermediate and especially the advanced stages, I do a ton of reading that takes over, where I do more reading than I would speaking. Because at that stage my goal is to have a mastery level, and that's a more overall encompassing reading, speaking, listening and so on. Whereas as a beginner, speaking is what I do because that is more of a priority than reading as a beginner would be. But you might be different, and that's fine. That depends on what your priorities, what you need to do in the language. So let's see. Joanna on YouTube says, how do you find logic skills, such as the skills you use to solve puzzles, do math and other stuff, helps with learning languages? For me, it really helps with internalizing language structures. That's an interesting way of putting it. Let me show you what. I can scribble something out. If you guys saw my last live video, I was explaining this thing here. This is my priority. What do I call it? my project pyramid. That's right. But I want to show you very quickly. If I think of a phrase in, let's say, Spanish. So están guapos. Okay. So if you look at this phrase, están guapos. They are handsome. They are good looking. For me, as someone with a background in engineering, I think of this as a mathematical formula. I think of the, let me underline them here. So I think of the, like, imagine there's an equal sign between these two words. Oh, there we go. And the, you know, you'd have, like, if you guys remember your equations with x's in them and so on. For me, this plural here corresponds to this plural here. The S corresponds to the N, and the, you know, you might have also the masculine here corresponding. In this case it doesn't, but it might correspond with something else. So I kind of started to comprehend these things almost like mathematical equations. So in my case, coming from a background of science, mathematics, engineering, that way of logically looking at grammar and new sentences and languages happened to help me. Now obviously some of you watching this may see me talking about like X's and equal signs and think that I'm absolutely bonkers, and that's totally fine. I'm cool with that. I'm fine with being called bonkers, but that is just how I, like Joanna, I happen to kind of think in that direction, and that helped me with learning languages. Okay, Langua Hub on YouTube. This is Pankaj Joshi from India. I'm learning French. Kindly share some learning tips for the French language, especially how to identify genders. Okay, alright. So we touched on this before, that you could use via another language. But if you want to specifically have shortcuts for French, I know what I can do. I happen to have the solution right here. Look at this. Boom. Sorry about this ugly guy on the cover there. But I wrote about this, and I have shortcuts about this in the book that I can show you guys right now, this very second, because one of the language hacks, which are the tips that we give at the back of the book, has a list of shortcuts that I use to get the gender right most of the time. Okay, which page was that? That is, yes, 59. So for French, these, what you want to do is you want to come up with a kind of rule of thumb for something that will work as much as possible, like most of the time. It's something we call the Pareto principle. You do something that is 20% of the work that gives you 80% of the output. So you will find when it comes to learning genders in or the genders of words in languages, that there are exceptions. And so a rule you learn won't apply 100%. But it's okay if you learn a rule that applies the vast majority of the time, and you remember that, because if you get it wrong, if you're speaking the language and that exception happens to come up and you say le instead of la, then you're not going to get attacked by people with machine guns, the angry people of the world who hate it when you make mistakes. No, people will just shrug it off and they'll correct you. So it's not the end of the world. But having said that, let me see. So if a word ends in a consonant in its singular form, it's probably masculine. So for instance, words that end in T, like le poulet is the chicken, le chocolat, the chocolate. Those just they end in a consonant. It's probably masculine. Loads of exceptions, but most of the time you'll see they're masculine. And if a word ends in E or ION in its singular form, because you have plurals as well, then it's probably feminine. So like for instance, you have une idée, an idea, la différence, la difference, the difference, la culture, the culture. So these are all feminine words because they end in an E, but then there's a particular combination of a couple of them, and I list them here. There's IE, UE, ANCE, ENCE. So there's about, like here on this one page, there's about like 20 examples. I don't know if you can make it out there. You can like pause the screen later and check that out. I would recommend you find that. And you can search for it online, like word endings for genders in French. If you search for something like that, you'll find the list, and try to learn that, because that's way better than learning each individual word's gender. That's not the way to do it, because the way it works in these languages that have gender is it just tends to be the endings of words in nearly every situation. How the word ends dictates how whether it's masculine, feminine, or neuter, or whatever the gender the language might have. And you find those patterns, you work most of the time, and then you find the exceptions, you apply those as needed. So that's what I would say. Okay, let's see, we've got Resvap on Periscope. What's the best French grammar book in English, in your opinion? Do I have that here in my collection? I know I do somewhere. Yes, I do. Excellent. I'm happy that I can answer the question demonstrating it. This is the book that I would recommend, French Grammar and Usage, and this is by Routledge, or the authors' names are Roger Hawkins and Richard Towell. So this book I find is very detailed. It explains like pretty much everything that'll come up, but the catch is it is very intense. It doesn't have a lot of pictures, doesn't have stories, so I would not recommend you use a book like this until you're at the intermediate stage where you've already got lots of practice in the language. Okay, and last couple of questions as we wrap this up. And again, I'll remind people to click subscribe, click the notification bell, and go to fluent3months.com, join my email list. That's where I'll tell you where the next live videos are going to be. And if you're one of the earlier questions, I tend to answer nearly all the earliest questions that come up. And that is for people who get the notifications or they know I'm about to go live. They tend to be there and ready to shoot me with those questions. So that's how you know I can definitely answer it next time. But yeah, moving on with the last few questions that I've got time for. Let's see. We've got essay on YouTube. If I can't talk to anyone and I want to learn Japanese, can I talk to myself? A lot of people do recommend that. They have a self-talk in the language, and they kind of maybe narrate their day. And they might think, I'm going to walk to the bank right now, and I'm going to take out money, and isn't that a cute dog? And they might like say all of these things, and I think that can be effective, and especially depending on your goals in the language. And you can really, you can do a lot when you do that. You can force yourself to think, how do I say that word? And you have your phone with you and you look it up. And that works for a lot of people. I personally don't do that because I find ways to get spoken practice from day one. So I'm going to be speaking the language anyway, and if I'm doing that, then I'm going to speak it with somebody who's going to give me more natural conversations. Because when you're self-talking, you tend to phrase things in a different way that you wouldn't necessarily do if you're talking to another person. So it's not something I use as often myself, but I would still say a lot of people do it. They get a lot of benefit out of it. It forces you to naturally process and use the language, so it might well work for you. And that's with any strategy. There's no right or wrong. Test things out, and you'll see whether you're good to do it or not. So I know I skipped a bunch of questions, and Holly's been passing me on lots of very interesting ones, but I'm going to wrap things up here, if that's good for people. I hope you enjoyed this. If you catch this near the end, then come back here in a few hours and scroll down, and there'll be a comment pinned on the YouTube version of this, because YouTube lets you click timestamps to go to particular parts, and you can see all the questions that people asked me and what the answer was that I gave people. So hope you've been enjoying this, and I'll be away for about a week, and then I'll come back and I'll start doing a lot more regular live videos. I'll keep you guys up to date on how my project to improve my time management is going, and as I learn things, I'll start sharing them with you. I already have a few ideas for some cool things to share with you there. I hope you've been enjoying this, everyone. Thanks for joining me, and I see all of your various mentions here. Guillermo, Renat S, Andy, thanks again, Andy, for the super chat. Nick Sykes on YouTube, and see loads of other people who have been writing comments on Facebook, Periscope, everywhere. I appreciate everything you guys have been writing to me. Thanks for following along with what I do and checking out all my videos. I appreciate it. I love trying to help you people, and seeing all of the nice comments and all of the lovely progress everyone makes. So thank you, and we will be in touch soon. Follow my channels and you'll see. I'll be happy to help you, and see you again soon. Happy language learning, everybody.